Yo, what's up? How you guys doing? It's been a long time since I've checked in with you. Okay, so today what I want to talk about is something that I'm terming polar distortions. And I don't know what I'm calling this video yet. I want to just share it and then I'll name it afterwards. But essentially what it's about is this thing that I'm calling polar distortions. And essentially what it is it's a kind of a derivative in a sense of like black and white thinking that I feel has been it's a framework for understanding black and white thinking as it's embedded itself into our consciousness as a basic way of perceiving reality that literally binds us to the matrix and actually acts as a kind of distortion pattern in our consciousness that causes us to dissipate our soul force energy. So here, I'll kind of start like this. I'm going to start with what a polar truth is. You could call it a polar truth or a polar collaboration. And then I'll talk about a polar distortion. That'll give more context to it. So a polar truth is something like, or a polar collaboration, I don't know the best terminology for it yet, is like day and night, masculine, feminine, yin and yang, right? So these kinds of things. And what constitutes it being a polar truth is that there's a harmony between the two poles. And ultimately, the two poles collaborate in a way that generates more. It's uplifting to life, nourishing to life force. It generates more, right? So if you harmonize the yin and yang, you can harness tremendous power as a martial artist, right? Or just any being that harmonizes yin and yang harnesses tremendous power. If you or you take masculine and feminine, you put man and woman together, they create a child, right? So it's generative in a sense, right? Regenerative. Now, a polar distortion is something where you're working on a spectrum and there's polarities in the same sense, but these polarities actually conflict with each other. They're at war with each other, right? So you could say like one really primary polar distortion that is at the core of, and I'm going to do a whole video on this, at the core of all, I think just about all of humanity's quarrels right now is one of inferiority and superiority, right? And the battle that each individual is having with the idea of inferiority and superiority, and the battle that people have with each other, fighting over superiority or fighting against inferiority. Right, so this is a polar distortion. And polar distortions come, now that one's more of like a greater framework in as far as like a grid work of understanding reality in general, because a polar distortion like inferiority, superiority presupposes that there is something that's inferior or superior. And again, I'm going to make a video on this so I can go like really deep into that one in particular. Fundamentally, what I'm doing here in this video is setting the basic framework to go into some of the most insidious and detrimental polar distortions that I think are strangling humanity right now, and that being one of them, inferiority, superiority. There's something I was going to say about that kind of slipped away. Oh right, yeah. So in order for, like, ultimately a polar distortion is an illusion, right? So it's an interpretation framework that is illusory, right? And that's why it's degregative in nature. Now, when I say illusory, I mean illusory in more of a macro sense, because you can have a real experience of it, though it's not it doesn't exist. It's illusory from a higher dimensional, from like a higher vibrational perspective. So what I mean by that is that um, if enough people are playing the game of inferiority, superiority, right, it becomes real. It's a real felt experience. People are entering into that reality. But it can exist like on many different levels, right? So that one's more of a basic framework for perceiving, reality. People oftentimes, many of us and all of us are to some degree still have to work with this. See reality in a frame in which there are things that are inferior and superior, right? But this can work on many different levels. So it can be character traits. It can be just different dynamics like domination, submission, right? It can be character traits like insecurity and arrogance. One great book where they talk about this in terms of archetypes, and I've mentioned this before in other videos about masculinity, is the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. But the way that they describe it in that book is that each one of those archetypes have a passive and an active shadow, right? So the warrior's active shadow is the bully, and its passive shadow is the wimp, right? The lover's active shadow is like the womanizer, and his passive shadow is like the putz that can't get any women at all. And so the way it's described there, kind of one of the morals of that book is describing how a developing young man or developing person in the world looks at different archetypes and then starts associating with different archetypes and then embodying the attributes of those archetypes. So depending on the archetypes that are available for them to emulate and identify with, that kind of sets the like a governor on what they're able to embody. And so if there's not enough examples of like the what I'm calling the transcendent, the alchemized transcendent, which would be the alchemized transcendent of the wimp and the bully would be the warrior, right? If there's not enough alchemized transcendence as an example, then a person can't orient towards that archetype and embody that as a being in their beingness, because there's nothing to help them become that, nothing to strive for. Whereas if all they're seeing is the distortion pattern, the polar distortion, right, of bully and wimp, then the tendency is, especially because of the way cultures continue to color these things malevolently, I may add, they'll go for rather be the bully than the wimp, right? Rather be the womanizer than the putz. And so the first kind of delusion and how this is used as a mind control kind of mechanism is selling humanity on the idea that this spectrum is all there is, right? That the spectrum between wimp and bully is all there is, and you got to choose one of those, right? And you see the people that have been most invested or duped into the control matrix paradigms that are at the stranglehold of humanity right now are those that have really entered into that game in a hardcore way. A lot of us probably feel that are watching this video probably feel we know that there's something above these polar distortions, but having a hard time orienting to how to kind of navigate through that. But an example of the kind of mentality that someone that say is a like an oligarch, that is a cutthroat business person, that is only out for themselves, will the kind of orientation that they'll have towards reality, or the paradigm that they'll use to justify that behavior, is one that buys into this idea that there is either, the dominator or the dominated, and there's nothing in between. It's like that philosophy that, and you'll hear people use this. I used to know people that really thought like this in kind of like the gangster rap kind of scene. And this is the idea that, if there's not, if you don't know the sucker in the room, then you are the sucker in the room. And so you either got to be the one that's, getting over on other people, or you're going to be the one that's getting taken advantage of. And that perspective is the perspective that drives this entire matrix. Well, perspectives like that drive this entire matrix. And what they have in common, these paradigms, is that they're polar distortions, right? They're operating within a certain polarized spectrum that is not collaborative, but is fundamentally at war. And therefore, when those philosophies become internalized, and this could be around all these different things, insecurity and arrogance, right? This is another example. So within a person, oftentimes people mistake, arrogance for confidence, right? Or they'll think that confidence is a balance point between insecurity and arrogance. It's like somehow you meet in the middle there, and then that's confidence. But the truth of the matter is that confidence, true confidence, is an alchemized transcendent. It exists on a whole different plane of it's a whole different paradigmatic grid work connected with a whole different psychic and astral and biological geometry. Actually, it's like in a different dimension. True confidence, or self-esteem, doesn't exist on the same spectrum as insecurity and arrogance. Insecurity and arrogance is like a locked, it's a closed circuit, and it's a closed circuit that is in constant conflict. And most of the issues that people have with self-esteem will never be ever healed working within that spectrum, because the idea that people have, if they're on the spectrum of arrogance or insecurity, is that by being arrogant, that is the cure for insecurity. And the problem with that is that they're two sides to the same coin. So the propensity that you have for arrogance is the same propensity that you have for insecurity. And you'll be in constant battle of trying to defend that arrogance, to the point in which you indulge in illusion in order to defend that arrogance. And then ultimately you'll have to face that illusion, which will swing you back into insecurity. And then you'll have to deal with that insecurity and then fight for your arrogance again. And you're in that circuit. It keeps you spinning in that. And ultimately, you see this played out externally between humans and social dynamics and things like this. But ultimately, this is the virus that exists inside people's consciousness. So the virus exists as the paradigmatic framework that sees that spectrum as all there is. Now, in an abstract way, most of us can see that, oh yeah, no, that spectrum's an illusion, and this other, the idea of confidence, the alchemized transcendent, is like in a different realm, especially after I mentioned that. But the tricky aspect to this whole thing is that it's so embedded into us, in our culture, from all the movies that we see, from all of the things we've been programmed with from the second that we were born, and the way that the world works is so embedded in these delusional frameworks that there's a reality that exists from that. And that reality is all around us, constantly reinforcing the illusion, in a sense. And so it's like anything with the Matrix. It's very easy to fall back into that illusion. And our shadow exists in the areas in which we don't know that we've agreed to that illusion on certain levels, right? And so we're still playing within that game, within that framework. And so my goal in this video is to really point out the idea of a polar distortion, give a few examples of polar distortions, and then go forward with new videos where I talk more specifically about very specific polar distortions that I think are extremely detrimental, so that we can kind of dislodge these programs in more of a holistic way. because until we have a really clear understanding of it, it's hard to identify where we might still be buying into it, right? And feelings of not being good enough, feelings of needing to have control over things, to dominate in situations, feelings like or self-orientations like insecurity or arrogance, like all these things, we're all vulnerable to falling into those things from time to time. But the degree of our vulnerability really has a lot to do with our ignorance to how we're still intertwined with these deep embedded belief systems. And many of us through trauma are intertwined all the way into our cells. Like our bodies are actually locked in certain places due to trauma, locked into these polar distortion paradigmatic grids. And so it is actually in the releasing of trauma that we have a cellular turnover that regenerates and then can give us an ethical upgrade in which we can start actually operating from a higher grid point that isn't intertwined with that. And that's part of the importance of doing the trauma work. But again, I wanted to give a framework so that we can understand polar distortions. And essentially that polar distortion is when that's embodied, it creates a schism within the individual, in which the individual is then dissipating their soul force or their life force, right? And then in that dissipation of soul force or life force, there is a fight to get life force. And that fight to get life force becomes externalized because the internal mechanism for life force is broken. So it becomes externalized, and then people start trying to cannibalize each other in order to get that life force. And this is the spectrum of inferiority, superiority, of domination, submission, of the insecurity and arrogance, all these different kind of ways that this shows up. Another one is helpless, fix it. And part of the thing in recognizing how the delusion kind of slips in or binds you to it is from the perspective that that one side of the distortion coin is somehow better than the other side, right? Instead of seeing them as equal distortions, because it's no better to be a victim than a perpetrator. It's no better to be a insecure than arrogant, right? Like these are part of the same vibrational signature, and so it's the same distortion within the individual, and it's the same frequency. And this is the problem with finger pointing culture, is that finger pointing culture, and also this is the problem with dominant aspiration culture, like the desire to dominate over the subordinate, or thinking that that's better in some way, or now culturally it's made it kind of more desirable in a circumstantial way. Like, for example, like here's a good example. There's very little difference oftentimes in the consciousness of law enforcement and criminals. Very often they're two ends of the same coin, like the punitive punisher, right? And then, the criminal. Both oftentimes have criminal minds, right? And you can see that cops and robbers game kind of playing out, right? Now, society sets structures up in which it's much more advantageous to be, a law enforcement. And this isn't to say that all law enforcement are playing this game. Some are actually stepping into, like a healthier kind of guardian kind of like archetype. But many of them aren't also. And so there's not much of a difference between these two different kind of modus operandi. I mean, it's the same modus operandi, really. It's just a different kind of expression of it. Is it gone passive or active, right? And so in recognizing that these things are equal distortions, and looking for the alchemized transcendent is the recipe for the ethical upgrade, as opposed to seeing it as, well, this is how it is. It's either one or the other, and I better choose, the active one because that one is more advantageous in the structure of society. One of the last things I want to talk about in this video is the idea of grids, and this is in relation to, you could think of it as dimensions, right? Or dimension shifting in a sense. But I'm going to speak of it in terms of like paradigms. And these belief system structures that we have geometric vibrations. These geometric vibrations are literally across the spectrum, from more of the draconian kind of control matrix geometries, or like square and octahedron kind of geometries, but tetrahedral, dodecahedral kind of geometries are the structure of more of the more liberated kind of like higher dimensional, higher vibrational consciousness. And these structures move from psychic levels all the way into, like I said, actual physical body levels. So you look at a structure like you could think of like the grid of, say, medical science, mainstream medical science as it's understood. That grid is like a locked grid. And if you're fully invested within that grid, then that will be the reality you experience, because there's confirmation is steadily being reinforced when you're vibrating within that space. But realize that each of these grids, from one perspective, could be thought of as like a different form of martial arts. This is one way of thinking of it. A different form of martial arts. So if you learn karate, for example, there's a whole system for how that works, and that system reinforces itself. And so if you were to to speak to a karate master that only believed in karate and no other martial arts, and said like, well, what's the proper way of blocking a fist? They'll give their way of doing it. They'll have their whole system for it, and that system reinforces itself. And because it reinforces itself, and there's and it works to a certain degree, it's cohesive and coherent with itself. It has a solidity to it, and if you lock into that, you can get stuck in that way of doing things. But recognize that all these different kind of paradigmatic grids are like their own martial arts in a sense. When you're on that grid, everything will reinforce itself, but it doesn't mean that there's not another grid that exists. But the problem is that people get locked in grids, and this is get gridlocked, and they think that is the only reality. And when you're locked in that grid and you're thinking that is the only reality, because it reinforces itself, because that's the nature of the way that it's created, is to reinforce itself, it can be even more convincing that that is all that there is. And I hope this is making sense. Another way kind of thinking of it is that there like thoughts in general. If you have think of this like a framework. This is maybe a better way of saying it. So you can have an entire framework for building a car, and like a whole system for how to, come up with the different aerodynamics and all the different materials and how to put them together. And anybody that creates anything creates a system surrounding it. And that system, once you step within the boundary of that system is like can become a complete system on its own. And everything, if it's perfected or gotten very tight, then what happens is that all the different elements of how it fits together well, and it works, right? And so it's self-reinforcing from within that system. But there's a border to that system. There's kind of like there's an edge to it. And that edge to it becomes when building a car is not relevant, then you step out of the building a car dimension and you can step into an entire different kind of grid work or a different, system, right? And but if the only system that you know is within that system, you could think that is all of reality. All of reality, is that system. If all you knew was building cars and there was no other dimension to reality other than the building of cars, you would think that is the entire reality until you step out of that system to another system. And so these other systems or these other grid works, essentially we're at like the intersection of like almost infinite different grid works that are layering in through us. But the grid work of Polar Distortions is the grid work that that is one of the fundamental, calling it Polar Distortions is like a meta understanding for a certain type of grid work construction that keeps people locked in a constant state of conflict, so that they dissipate their energy, so that energy can be farmed by by hyperdimensional beings. And this is why this whole system has been reinforced from the second you were born, that in order to get things done, you need to dominate the competition, you need to be the superior one, you need to it's better to be arrogant than it is to be insecure. The whole system's built off of these kind of presuppositions that are taken as a given because of the way that the world has trained us to think, and that fundamentally keeps us locked in this lower grid. So when you can understand that there's alchemical transcendence that exist that are on a completely different spectrum, you can actually start operating from a different grid work, and each one of these grid works is like a dimension in itself. So when you start vibrating with a different grid work, you can start streaming in wisdom and information from these different grid works that you would never have access to otherwise. So, for example, it's like if somebody never believed in the idea of reincarnation, right? That's like a whole grid work in and of itself, right? So if you never believe that's even possible, think of the limitations of how you would think, right? But then once that's something that becomes available to you, you open up a new geometric grid work that can actually vibrate through your cells and can influence or opens accessibility in the astral, in your etheric body, and all these different levels to a whole different spectrum of consciousness. And now ideas and thoughts and realizations stream in that expand you. You become more expanded, right? And so recognizing that the governors of the low vibration hold on the population are various. And one of the key governors is polar distortions, which is convincing us into a paradigmatic lens of black and white thinking that turns internal conflict upon us, that then is then experienced as external conflict as we act it out in our reality. And it's everywhere, right? You see it done through religions, you see it done through it's anywhere that things are split and there's two sides of an issue. Divide and conquer. That's essentially what it is, divide and conquer. But the divide and conquer starts within the individual, creating schisms within the individual, and then distortion perceptions on reality that cause them to act in reality based off of a lie that fundamentally causes people to give up their life force. So that's all I'm going to give you on that today. What I am going to do, like I said, is in future videos, I want to go deeply into inferiority, superiority, because that's one of the deep ones. Another one is victim, perpetrator. That one's actually victim, perpetrator. It's a tripolar distortion, victim, perpetrator, savior, which is something that's really important to get into. But I'm going to get into these ones and, in a sense, kind of debunk them and orient us towards the alchemical transcendent, so there can be more clarity with that, because it's hard to sometimes really identify what that alchemical transcendent is, and differentiate it from the soup of distortions that sometimes we see attributes of the transcendent kind of like linked in with. So that will be some of the next videos I put out. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. This is Patrick Hayes. If you guys haven't donated to my music fund and you like my music, I got some really awesome stuff coming up. I have a new music video that's finished, a new song that I'm releasing, and it's awesome. And I haven't decided exactly when I'm releasing it. Probably sometime in June it's going to release, and you're really gonna like it. So if you like my music and you haven't donated to my music fund, go donate to that music fund so I can keep making music, bringing it to you. If you aren't following me on Telegram, go over to Telegram, check out Patrick Hayes Live and Patrick Hayes Channel. Those are my two different channels on Telegram. And yeah, thank you so much for going on this exploration with me. And I'm excited to check in with you next time and bring you more on these polar distortions. So much love to you, and I'll talk to you next time.